Yeah. Mm.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Please, can you confirm that you can hear me? Please confirm that you can hear me very well.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. It's the October edition of the Lex Lata monthly seminar series. We've been having these seminars since the beginning of the year, and this afternoon we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Muntaqa Umar-Sadiq, who is the head of the Energy Transition Office in the Office of the Vice President of Nigeria. I've known Muntaqa for about 13 years now, since our days at Cambridge University. And he's done very well for himself. Muntaqa is one of those very special people. He wears several hats. So he's a medical doctor. He trained as a medical doctor, which makes him an expert in the area of health. And he's also a finance expert. I know only very few people who can combine the two. So I think one of them is the current Minister of Trade and Investment, and just a few other people that I know who are able to combine both. That's finance and health. He worked as a technical advisor to the Minister of Health at some point. I know that he was also the CEO of the Private Sector Health Alliance. And he's done so many other things in the area of health. And now he's into finance as well. And he's also an energy consultant. So he wears several hats. And I believe that we'll be getting something very, very brilliant from him this afternoon. So the topic is a very interesting one. I believe it's a topic that many of our interns at Lex Lata would benefit a lot from. So without further ado, Muntaqa, I welcome you to Lex Lata Centre. I will hand over to Abigail now to carry on from here. So we look forward to a very brilliant presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Welcome to everyone to our October edition of the monthly seminar. I will now go ahead to read out our speaker's profile. Dr. Muntaqa is the Program Manager and Head of the Nigeria Energy Transition Office, mandated to implement Nigeria's energy transition plan and secure a $10 billion investment package. Muntaqa has over 15 years of impact investing, energy financing, policy and consulting experience in the energy sector, including aspiring healthcare advisor, investment banker at Morgan Stanley Energy and Healthcare PPP advisor to the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, senior advisor, Oxygen Hub, inaugural CEO of the Private Sector Health Alliance of Nigeria, the lead consultant to private sector engagements in the World Bank, amongst others. He commenced his career as an investment banker at Morgan Stanley in the UK, where he focused on the healthcare and oil and gas sectors. Muntaqa is a graduate of the University of Cambridge, England, where he did an MPhil in Bioscience Enterprise and undertook an MBBS Medical Sciences degree at Imperial College School of Medicine, London. Muntaqa is a chartered alternatives investment analyst and was honored as a 2016 World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and selected as a 2018 Eisenhower Innovation Fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Muntaqa. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Thank you very much for that introduction, and I think it's really great to be here. Please indicate if anyone cannot hear me. I think a couple of things as I kind of reflect in participating in this discussion. I think Wale and I were actually flatmates in Cambridge, and I think it's always gratifying to see the evolution and growth. So from a personal perspective, it's really great to be here to continue the kinds of conversations we used to have at dinner back in the day. So thank you for this invitation. The second is that I think this conversation is quite timely and relevant, particularly in terms of where we are today. So I want to spend some time giving a presentation around, giving some color around this prominent discussion on energy transition. So providing that context, but also highlighting both the challenges as well as the opportunities as we seek to implement an energy transition plan in the country. So I'm going to share my screen now and do a brief presentation. But at any point during the presentation, I think I'm very open to kind of having a dialogue to both learn as well as kind of engage with you guys here. So I'll just go ahead and do that and kick off. So I think I'll just give it some time to upload, I guess. But I think in the meantime, I can start. I want to begin with the context, and I think the context in country is that there are a number of transitions going on at the same time in Nigeria, right? We have more recently seen a political transition with a new crop of leaders in the political arena. That has implications for not just agenda settings, but how as a country we think about our ability to decarbonize or engage around some of the energy related constraints that we have as a country. The second is that we're also seeing a demographic transition. So we have a youthful bulge as a country, and the manner in which we invest in that youthful demographic can either be a blessing or a curse for the country, particularly as we think about situating it within the economic transition that is ongoing. So new realities in terms of the volatility of oil prices, but we have also seen subsidy removal and the impact that has had both in terms of livelihoods, but even in terms of transportation and the cascading effect that it has had in the lives of an average Nigerian. But even as these economic, political, and demographic transition happen, we're seeing two additional transitions compound the effect of what we feel as Nigerians. First is an energy related issue, because I think there's an energy poverty that we need to be cognizant about. One is, I believe Nigeria is the largest unelectrified bloc as a globally, right? In addition, over 90 million Nigerians lack access to energy. Over 174 million Nigerians lack access to clean cooking solutions. So this is significant. So this kind of theme around energy poverty within this context is quite critical. But as this energy-related constraint happens, we're also seeing simultaneously a climate-related issue emerge, right? Because we are seeing firsthand the consequences of climate change. Recently, flooding in different parts of the country, desertification, erosion, pollution. I think, the issue has, if you like, come to the fore. And so the convergence of all of these transitions, whether it is the climate change transition as well or the energy poverty, creates the backdrop for Nigeria in having to come up with a bold initiative to address our energy poverty issues on the one hand, but also our decarbonization or climate change related issues. And a few years ago, during COP26, the president then kind of announced Nigeria's aspirations around achieving universal access to energy by 2030, and in the longer term, net zero by 2060. But I want to make a couple of points here, because in reality, Nigeria does not, compared to sort of global emissions, does not emit significant amounts on the one hand, right? And most other countries have had the opportunity, if you like, to harness their own natural resources, particularly when it comes to in order to industrialize. And so our own kind of energy transition agenda has largely been around, one, harnessing our gas as a transition fuel to give us that opportunity. Yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I can hear you.
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you.
All right. I think, but you can't see my screen anymore, right?
No, we can't.
Okay. Let me just pull that up. Okay, good. Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. All right. So I was just providing the context around how Nigeria, our lens through which we look at energy transition. One is we want to prioritize our ability to industrialize. And so for that, gas to an extent has to be on the table, right? That is one. Two is that we recognize that, if you like, we are the victims of the consequences of climate change, right? Relatively. So there is a unique opportunity to, one, understand our biggest sources of emission and industrialize at the same time as we decarbonize. And so there's kind of a pathway that is worth looking at as a country. So how can we industrialize on the one hand, but also doing it in a manner that is consistent with not adding to this global burden, particularly around emissions. And the way we have approached that is that we recognize that 60% of our emissions are driven largely by energy consumption or industrial processes. In fact, in the context of Nigeria, when we see energy consumption, is largely driven by our petrol, generators, petrol gensets, petrol and kind of diesel gensets. So our ability to shift towards, cleaner sources, both on and off grid, whether it's solar on the one hand, or gas as a transition fuel, becomes quite important. So our transition thesis really is about diesel displacement first. Going from the huge burden around diesel, because I think easily, even in Lagos, if you look at the burden around the diesel exposure, easily for 2 gigawatts. So we're talking about significant amounts. And so for us, our thesis is really around diesel displacement. But beyond that, we recognize that there are 5 important sectors that really represent over 60% of our emissions. And we are starting with those sectors to really flip it and understand how can we both outline a pathway towards decarbonization, but doing it in a manner that is consistent with our economic priorities. Because our goal when it comes to the energy transition plan is really around achieving universal access by 2030, like I mentioned earlier, and net zero by 2060. And so to do that for these 5 sectors, one, energy, like I've mentioned, and that's largely around solar in the short term, and some of the work off grid, scaling up solar home systems, mini grids, advancing some of the conversations or projects around interconnected mini grids and things like that, and displacing diesel and gensets, and what are the sorts of models that we can use to do that at scale. So that's kind of on the power side, but also doing this while paying attention to the grid, right? So debottlenecking the issues. We recognize that obviously the base load on grid would have to, in reality, have to be gas. But some of the utilities on grid debottlenecking that will need to happen. And so that's what kind of the power or energy, the power conversation looks like. The second important sector is really around, I would say first, clean cooking. And clean cooking, if you look at some of the recent data from the Bureau of National Bureau of Statistics, NPI, majority of Nigerians really lack access to clean cooking solutions. I mean, there are areas in the north where they're still using cow dung to cook. There are areas that typically it's charcoal, kerosene, firewood. And if you imagine the impact that that has, particularly around gender, right? So the opportunity cost of spending all your time all day using firewood to cook when there are more efficient ways, the opportunity cost around the women being productive participants in the economy. So there's a gender imperative there, but there's also a health related implication, right? So if you look at what air quality does in terms of respiratory illness and some other chronic disorders, there's a significant health burden on the back of clean cooking. And the third is really around deforestation, right? So firewood, and all the traditional cooking methods, has an impact in terms of deforestation. So our agenda really is to move from these traditional, cooking methods to cleaner sources, particularly around LPG, so harnessing our natural resources, in terms of gas, but also electric cooking. And so the pathway is around, tens of millions, so over 30 million Nigerians. How can we help in terms of the switching? Where does it make sense to switch from, charcoal, kerosene to biogas or LPG? Where does it make sense in terms of jurisdictions, urban and peri-urban areas, to go directly towards electric cooking, leveraging on areas where, agencies like REA have already deployed mini-grid solutions. And so that kind of integrated energy mapping type approach is what is critical. So in partnership with SE for All, the government has kind of laid out this integrated energy planning tool that is helping to inform the private sector in terms of their investments, actually on the power side, off-grid, but also the catchment areas to target and to be a bit more bespoke as to its interventions in terms of what are the right kinds of solutions for different needs. And I think in this area, we're seeing that the kinds of technologies or products becomes quite significant because it's very context specific. There's a particular eating habit. There's a particular influence model that is important to ensure the adoption of these types. So is there any question? Or? Okay. Okay, I'll just go on. So the clean cooking agenda, I think, is a very important one because of the impact that it can have on multiple levels, and we can speak a bit more about that. We've supported the government in its effort to actually develop a clean cooking policy using an evidence-based approach to catalyze the private sector to address some of the product development issues. On the demand side, working with, both community and traditional leaders and women groups around kind of the demand creation, because there's a systems lens that we need to incorporate in the manner that we advance the adoption of more of cleaner sources of cooking. The third is transport. And for transport, I think the more recently, particularly on the back of the removal of subsidies, I think we've now seen the government try out, other means of e-mobility or CNG-driven mobility. So I think that and this is really the menu in terms of what's in the energy transition plan. The plan seeks to move towards either CNG, but I think prioritizing electric vehicles. but also recognizing the need for obviously charging infrastructure, the viability, right, around the costing and fees. And so I think a couple of months ago, NEC, the National Economic Council, kind of announced, the plan to roll out, electric mass transit buses in certain states. In some states, it's CNG related kind of mass transit programs. But when it comes to electric mobility, that is often complemented with 2 and 3 wheelers and things like that. Because I think we have a choice as a country to either embark on the pathway where in the short term we are leveraging on, we're going towards CNG. So, but if you look at the constraints around building out a gas infrastructure, and the fact that automobiles are largely a second-hand market, and if you look at where the world is going, particularly around some of the legislations in countries looking to mitigate our current kind of automobile stock, everyone is going EV. What does that mean for us as a country? Like, so in 5-10 years, if we're going the path of CNG, will there even be a second-hand spare parts for those vehicles at that period? And so should we be leapfrogging, for example, towards electric vehicles? So those kinds of conversations, even though both are on the table and different states are responding to that opportunity in different ways, but I think that's kind of an important consideration. So in fact, my office led the engagement with various state governors to help define, because for some states it may make sense. Some states that are quite close to gas infrastructure, it may make sense to go the CNG route. For other states, like in the north, where they have obviously abundant solar related resources, may make sense to do otherwise. But these are kind of the kinds of debates going on in government. The other important sectors are linked to industry as well as oil and gas. But I kind of wanted to give some color around what the decarbonization pathway looks like for these different sectors, but how we are also looking to industrialize even as we get greener or cleaner. You will notice that, as part of this conversation, we have discussed a number of sectors, from environment to power to transportation. And so energy transition is quite cross-cutting, and the governance arrangement and agenda setting becomes quite important, right? Because then the coordination and alignment with the oil and gas sectors, with the folks in water resources or even foreign affairs becomes a bit prominent. And that's why a lot of the discussion is really situated within the presidency, or the vice president's office, because of that need to oversee a cross-cutting agenda and governance arrangement. We estimate that the plan to achieve net zero by 2060 will cost roughly $410 billion in excess of business as usual spending. That's roughly $10 billion every year. And this informs our plan to kickstart this effort with $10 billion. This slide here kind of highlights some of the important cost drivers of this amount across the energy value chain, but the other kind of sectors that represent where our biggest emissions lie. And so we developed an approach that highlights the importance of, one, financing to kickstart the process, but secondly, the importance of market shaping, because ultimately we need to invest, we need to shape the market in which we invest in. We do not want to be in a position where we are importing everything. Like, how can we catalyze green manufacturing across these different verticals that we have mentioned, whether it's in clean cooking solutions or for transportation or for mini grids? How can we use that as a basis to create that paradigm shift in the sector so that we go from being this economic drag to net contributors of economic growth and job creation? And so that kind of market shaping industrialization agenda is quite important. But even as you look upstream in the value chain, what are the components of these mini grids or solar systems or EV that we can inhabit locally, right? On the mining side, in terms of minerals and metals. And so how can we create that broader ecosystem? And there's a lot of work on something called AREMI, African Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative, to begin to unlock the value chain in this direction. The third piece is a lot of thinking that we have done and actions related to the skills and knowledge transfer required. So if as a country, we have this kind of 40-year plan till 2060, and we're talking about potentially, going from our traditional energy methods, whether it's in oil and gas or diesel, to cleaner sources, so solar, down the line, even green hydrogen, ensuring that is also being mapped against our capacity needs, right? So what is the reskilling and retooling required for our existing oil and gas sector in order to be consistent with this path that we've laid out towards energy transition? The fourth and fifth really are around agenda setting regionally. Nigeria was the first country to actually develop an energy transition plan. And now we have seen several other countries, five on the continent, kind of follow suit in terms of having a country-led, context-specific plan that speaks to our industrialization as well as our net zero timelines. Ghana, more recently, I was in Nairobi a few weeks ago, where the president announced its own versions and worked closely with us in terms of sharing our learnings as well as our challenges in the manner that we've done that. One of the limitations that we have seen, for Nigeria to be the first country to have this kind of detailed energy transition plan means that we navigated the political economy quite rapidly. And oftentimes the downside of that is that the degree of inclusivity and consultations required, whether it's with the Niger Delta folks, because of those significant trade-offs around jobs, or the civil society or women groups for clean cooking, though that was done, I think it was relatively suboptimal. And so we have had to continue that process even as we've had a FEC-approved energy transition plan. And I think some of those learnings we've been able to kind of disseminate to other countries within the continent. And so the themes around prioritizing, job creation or industrialization, in our case, gas as a transition fuel, ensuring that we have an agenda that is additive to our job creation drive. As a country, our priority around, poverty more broadly, so lifting over 100 million people out of poverty. So ensuring that alignment between a country's priorities and its kind of energy transition agenda has been quite important. And this has resonated with many countries, Kenya, Ghana, and a few others that are embarking on similar efforts. And I think that also provides an important backdrop for this emerging consensus on the continent, something called the Kigali communique around Africa more broadly, having a common position towards this, right? Because look, if Africa triples its gas exposures, for example, it only adds relatively little, actually not up to 4%, if I remember correctly, to global emissions. And so, so that allows you to understand our bargaining power when it comes to some of these global conversations. If you map that against what the US, China, what they contribute, and you also map that against the consequences of climate change, right? And what does that mean in terms of the negotiations that we need to have, particularly around climate financing or the financing for gas as a transition fuel? There are some limitations in terms of that. So I think that provides the kind of context to some of these conversations. I think on the one hand, we have seen in plans are one thing, but in reality, delivery is quite is key to it, right? Because Nigeria, we don't lack for plans and policies. Our issue has really been around implementation, right? And in this context, our ability to curate a package of interventions or projects that are relatively viable. I think those are the important preconditions to mobilizing the resources and advancing the implementation parameters to have impact. And for us, impact is really around, megawatts as well as net zero, reducing carbon emissions. And so for that, we have curated a pipeline of projects that kind of represented $230 billion investment opportunities across the value chain. So from generation, transmission, distribution, to gas flare commercialization. You might have seen recently the NUPRC announced this gas flare commercialization projects, and different private sector companies successfully bidding to repurpose our gas flares into things like clean cooking, into supporting power interventions. And we're quite pleased about that. We have on the e-mobility side, working with the government around rolling out, thousands of electric mass buses, but doing it in a very with the right kinds of guarantees, but with a business model that ensures that both the private as well as public sector have a viable construct for each party. There are also opportunities around healthcare, so solarizing or powering nearly 93 tertiary hospitals, and that's relatively early, but that is something that will, of course, have an impact, not just in terms of life saved, but also in building out the right ecosystems, right? Basically, health systems improvement more broadly in terms of both health systems infrastructure, because I think the way we think about health is in two phases. One is there's an impact of climate change on health, right? So if you look at the environment, water and cholera, as well as those related things. But secondly, the health system infrastructure itself, right? So and the impact that it has on quality of care. So there are lots of quality related issues as a result of power, right? More recently we've heard about cases of in obs and gynae surgery where light goes off and surgeon mistakenly, for example, clips off the aorta. So there are real, life and death issues that happen because of, limited power and the impact that it has in terms of the availability of care. So I think that's something that we are quite excited about. Some kind of interconnected mini grid projects. There are some, so lots of but our ability to harness and engage around these pipeline of projects is quite important in terms of what results or impact looks like. But I wanted to give a flavor of the kind of projects that we're talking about. This slide just also outlines some of the quick wins. So engaging World Bank, for example, having about $1.5 billion to support kind of off-grid interventions and some of the enabling policy interventions required. More recently, we have seen that on the back of the constitutional, the Power Act, which enables state governments to now originate, transmit, and distribute power, and what opportunities does that create in terms of, first at the state level, having the regulators, IPOs, and shaping the market to facilitate kind of private sector investments, across the chain. And so this slide just kind of summarizes some of the important highlights. I have touched on this, but I think a part to highlight too is really the role of the private sector. I think one, for us, like I mentioned, diesel displacement is an important kind of transition thesis. So quantifying that and figuring out the right business models to address those problem statements. But we're also excited about the work that we're doing with the private sector energy transition working group. And so the stewardship from the private sector towards unlocking capital for energy transition projects. But secondly, figuring out what needs to be done to be able to tap into the pension funds and other institutional investors locally. Another important opportunity here is really around the JET piece, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. We have seen the G7, for example, mobilize pool capital towards supporting different countries in their efforts or journeys towards energy transition. With South Africa received $8.4 billion from G7, Indonesia $20 billion, 10 public, 10 private, Senegal even about 2.9, and Nigeria is kind of putting together its investment package to engage in around this agenda. And so having the pipeline of projects, being clear about our macro case when it comes to kind of diesel displacement, and having government commitments around a number of emerging projects in EV, for example, or powering healthcare is quite important in this direction. So I kind of wanted to end with some of our big bets, and I've just spoken about one, which is really around JET piece. I think the second is for the numbers to add up, right? I mentioned it'll cost roughly $410 billion in excess of business as usual spending. For the numbers to add up, our ability to shape the market around carbon market development. And thankfully, the vehicle through which that happens, the National Council on Climate Change, has now been set up with great leadership to drive a lot of the policy and regulatory frameworks required to support both the voluntary carbon markets as well as the compliance markets. And I think the ability to unlock additional climate financing, carbon financing, is significant. So if you look more broadly at the continent, the premiums in terms of dollar per tons for projects or offsets related to clean cooking is significant. We're hoping to ensure that diesel displacement as well is able to attract the sort of carbon related premiums. Same thing with kind of solar projects. And so our ability to ensure that the new oil is carbon offsets is quite is an important part of that journey. And some of the work that the NCCC is doing, as well as ACME, the African the African Carbon Market Initiative, is very important in this effort. Third is some of the work that I mentioned around the importance of engaging your local private sector and tapping into local institutional investors, but being very clear about the barriers to investments, whether it's on the liquidity issues in the power sector or tariff related issues, or even if it's things around liberalization of mini grid licenses or fiscal policies in terms of import tariffs and taxes or dispatch order issues. I think those are important kind of bottlenecks that as a team we're kind of debottlenecking to ensure that the fiscal flows related to energy transition can happen. So I think that has been an important piece. And the last, I think, important lesson for us is that what we're seeing is that even where we are in terms of our fiscal space and debt profile as a country, there's an opportunity to engage around debt for clean energy investments and be a bit strategic about some of the conditionalities around energy transition and our ability to mitigate or downsize in terms of our debt profile as a country. And we're sort of part of those conversations. I'll stop here for now, but I kind of just wanted to highlight, just the real journey that we've been through. A bit imperfect, but we're quite optimistic about our ability to kind of mobilize partnerships as well as resources to advance this agenda to achieve universal access to energy by 2030, but also down the line net zero by 2060. So I think I'll kind of stop here for now, and happy to have any conversations down the line. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa. There are a number of questions here, and I'll read them out to us. The first question is from Stella, and she's asking, is there a plan for the encouragement of the use of electric vehicles in Nigeria to achieve the decrease in vehicular emissions plan? How will this plan affect the business of vehicle importers and sales companies around the country and their contribution to the GDP? Also, how would such a plan be brought to work, as it requires charging stations for electric vehicles to be built? Would petrol stations be converted to conserve resources such as land use? That's the first question, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I think I can start with that. So I think great question. I had mentioned earlier that the removal of petrol subsidy has really created a new paradigm, right? Particularly around the unit economics for different kinds of mobility solutions, right? And this is why you're now hearing in Nigeria CNG buses. Some state governors now, exploring. So even in Lagos, for example, if you look at what Wando is doing, there are already a number of electric buses already. So this is no more theory. And what they do is, because I think the key things to solve for with electric vehicles, largely around the charging infrastructure, you're totally right. But also the digital payment systems required, being clear around, like having your equivalent of power purchase agreements, whether you're linking it to per kilometers in terms of kind of journey times of these vehicles, and then the power source, right? So are we using the discos, right? Or is it off-grid? Is it solar plus storage, right? So a lot of the unit economics, the numbers will need to add up to ensure that it is it's valuable. What we're seeing is that, because I think you had mentioned the is it going to be filling stations? No, it's going to be the bus depots that you see in Lagos. I think those are the places where charging stations will be incorporated. States like Lagos and Abuja, we're likely to see them act as early champions, right? To almost prototype what a viable model may potentially look like. And we're seeing a lot of private sector activity. In the case of those states, we're seeing different routes almost get concessioned out to different kind of private sector companies. I have been part of the conversations around, I don't want to, government will soon announce this agenda, so I don't want to say too much, but there will be an EV kind of mass transit kind of program that will be potentially rolled out, but obviously starting in different phases. And you need to obviously, and we're supporting Lagos in developing the business plan, because down to the digital payment systems, several states, you almost have to have the underlying mechanism for Lagos, they have Lamata, so because they have, agencies, the transport authorities with payment systems and, routes clearly planned out. So I think, different archetypes of states and where these depots will be, what routes are viable, that's the kind of, insight and rigor that is required. And we're kind of supporting states in developing what that business plan may look like, where and what makes sense, and where the charging infrastructure will be and how it will be powered. Because I think a lot of people focus on the bus itself, but that's, it's a charging infrastructure, battery, payments, routes kind of play within the context of a right policy framework. So there's a lot of, so it will have to be the right states so that at least people can have a clear line of sight when it comes to return on investments on the one hand, but also ensuring that the affordability in terms of people using these services is still in line as they switch, right? But I think from the end users, it must be the same experience. Like they should not necessarily be able to tell that, oh, this is being, batteries are being swapped, or this is being charged overnight in a depot. That's, that we should be totally agnostic to that. It should be same quality of experience, but also the affordability aspect should be similar. So I think these are kind of the important moving parts as we, so the e-buses itself is kind of the minor part of the conversation, I think, but figuring out the charging infrastructure, the power solution, the tariffs that make sense, and the model of public-private partnership. And in fact, there are a number of models emerging, and different states might have preferences for different aspects. So that conversation we're kind of testing in terms of what is potentially possible in different states. Now, whilst because when we say e-mobility yes, there is the buses, electric buses, but also there are various settings where it's the 2 and 3 wheelers that is commercially viable, right? Where you could like leverage the mini grids, have models around battery swaps. That is currently being tested, so partners like GIZ and others, RMI, are actually already doing this. And so whilst there's a lot of kind of public sector support, whether it's states or federal level, needed on the kind of e-bus side, we're seeing a market-led approach emerge for the 2 and 3 wheelers. So I kind of just wanted to and other productive uses as well. I just wanted to make those points.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa. On to the next question from Stella again. For the transition to solar power, is there a plan to cover some parts of the Sahara Desert in solar panels? And is there ongoing research on better effective means of energy conservation and the maintenance of wildlife and the ecosystem in that area? Is something like the Morocco North Solar Mirror field plant possible for Nigeria? Is the cost for such included in the 1.9 trillion, or would bring about additional costs?
Thank you. I think that is that will be additional costs. I think to answer your question, the Africa Development Bank, I think that's the initiative you're talking about, because you're right, there is a unique opportunity to achieve some of the economies of scale benefits on the one hand, in terms of the technology solar. Because, if you think about it, the key cost lever or driver when it comes to solar is land, right? And so, in the Sahara, where there's the abundance of that, it does make sense to explore leveraging those resources for solar, particularly as you have abundant solar resources therein. So I think that's kind of the thesis behind that project. But I would let African Development Bank speak to that, because they've been the ones kind of driving that project. On your second question, others have a lot of the focus on the energy transition has largely been around energy transition and those 5 sectors, right? So it has been energy related projects, so solar. Down the line, I'm sure we'll get to green hydrogen, but that hasn't necessarily been costed. So a lot of the transmission, generation, and distribution type infrastructure has been a significant part of the costing, both on the CapEx and OpEx side. Same thing with what is required to achieve our decarbonization pathways for example, EV, both 2 and 3 wheelers, but also the buses. On clean cooking, initially the goal around switching for 30 million Nigerians, some of the underlying costing related to that. So that has not actually incorporated a lot of nature-based solutions and forestation aspect. I think that's largely because remember, it's about transitioning for us. So the environment agenda is, in terms of climate action, mitigation and adoption, I think that's kind of costed differently. So the $410 billion in excess of business as usual spending does not cover those costs.
All right, Doctor, thank you very much for that. Our next question is from Dr. Akuniji. He's asking, what's the difference between what your office does and what the National Council on Climate Change does? Thank you.
So the National Council on Climate Change is what we do really complements some of our efforts. I mean, they are the vehicle for shaping and advancing the carbon market. Developing they are the signatory for, I guess, UNFCCC, developing the carbon budget and being the regulator in terms of kind of unlocking that space and really driving climate action more broadly, I think is what they do. So they have a very critical part. In fact, some of the work that we do complements them actually. So they are absolutely the vehicle in government institutionally to drive that agenda. The nature of the work that we do on our side is really to complement some of these existing issues. existing institutions, because there is a cross-cutting nature, right? So someone has to deal with transportation, someone has to deal with clean cooking, someone has to deal with power, so we see that kind of complementary role to support some of their agenda, because there's an energy related conversation. So we spend a lot of time with the Ministry of Power. But then there's the environment piece, right, in terms of the decarbonization. And so we really sit at that nexus to bridge those gaps, but ensure that there are synergies between the needs of both sectors to kind of advance this, government agenda to achieve net zero goals.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa. To the next question from Dr. Akunji. In your view, what are the sorts of regulations or legislations that would help to manage the tension between climate action on the one hand and economic development on the other? Thank you.
Well, I think the way to think about it is to work backwards, right? So I think, what are the constraints that we're seeing in the power sector in terms of energy, as well as climate, to advance or achieve our goals, right? And you would hear things around on-grid issues, so dispatch orders, and those kind of related issues in the sector itself, major liquidity, tariff, gas issues for on-grid. So there are situations there, but also there are mini-grid license type issues. So it's typically three things. It's policies and regulations and access to capital related issues. On the climate side, I think that we have a big win, or a quick win, around having a National Council on Climate Change. There are many other African countries that do not have that. So there is legislation backing, the regulatory framework for developing our own carbon markets and driving climate action. So I think, to an extent, enforcement really becomes, and that's really a political will and agenda setting type narrative. The thing is that for us as a country, it's about striking that balance between advancing our economic priorities, and that's why we have gas as a transition fuel, right? So we will not, we will not do anything that harms our own kind of economic agenda. So I think that is important, even as we lay out this framework for achieving net zero kind of down the line. So us having a National Climate Act that has been passed and set up the creation for NCCC has been incredibly helpful. Enforcement is, I think, to an extent, the issue, and I think that's just a matter of time. It's a relatively new organization, so I think that is where I see the gap, the real delta for now. But with time, that would easily be resolved.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa. Our next question is from Precious, and she's asking, does it seem like the world can switch to renewable energy fully in the next 50 years, or it will likely be part fossil fuels and part renewable energy for a long time to come? Thank you.
I think that's a difficult one to answer, just because there is significant fragmentation, right? And there are context-specific issues that different countries kind of contend with, right? So for the likes of Nigeria, maybe Senegal, you can see how one, based on the natural resources that we're blessed with, meaning our least cost path to development and industrialization will likely include gas, right? We will continue to need gas to establish base load capacity on the grid. So that path is quite clear. For other countries, coal decommissioning, so coal will continue to play an important, and I think every country should be given the space to decentralize, even as they figure out their own context-specific way to decarbonize. And so I think to answer that question, next 50 years and having a blanket type approach, I don't see that. I think there'll be context-specific pathways that will be included, and I think country-led efforts that prioritizes their ability to create jobs for their people, but also harnesses their own least cost path towards industrialization, and also recognizing that, in reality, particularly gas, really adds limited, there's limited additionality in terms of emissions down the line. So I think that's how I will think about it. For Nigeria, the government has kind of set out this 2060 agenda. There were discussions around, is that too early? Is that too late? But I think ultimately, this is about, a line of sight, right? And, as a country or the government holding itself accountable towards trying to, in some areas, accelerate our climate journey, our net zero kind of aspirations, and in other areas, wanting sometimes, in fact, for us, we added 10 more years to our Decades of Gas initiative because we needed that space and time to harness our, to have gas as a transition fuel and industrialize or develop accordingly. So I think we will see a lot of these kind of context-specific journeys. And in fact, to an extent, or in some cases, a recalibration of timelines, based on other confounders that come in. No one knew that COVID was going to happen. So there are different macro headwinds that may occur that I think may open up that conversation around resetting some of these timelines. So I think we're less, I see the energy transition plan as a living document, right? As a government, you have the right to incorporate lessons, curate lessons as the goalpost changes, right? Like not necessarily the goalpost, but as the reality of your macro environment, or the unit cost of your technologies, or the dynamics of your political economy. As those important levels change, I think there's an opportunity to also course correct accordingly. So I think this notion of being fixated, for example, with certain kinds of timelines, I think that thinking really removes what the purpose of that is meant to be. Really, this is about having a line of sight, a line of direction to inspire different sectors, to set up different sectors, to go towards different kinds of decarbonization pathways, and facilitate the kind of investments that'll be required to industrialize, like I mentioned earlier.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa. Our next question is from Precious again. He's asking if Lagos and Abuja will be the prototype states for EVs, electric vehicles. Does it seem like other states will follow quickly? Thank you.
So I think that ultimately with these kinds of sectors, with EV, where you're trying to demonstrate to an extent different business models and commercial viability, it does make sense. So or you can see why the private sector will go towards where they think they can, that they have not just the investment requirements, but they can see returns, right? So in some respects, you kind of need to allow the market follow suit. But for us, what's important is to really have a menu of business models, because I think beyond those states that you have mentioned, there are other states where different business models can be a bit more palatable. And we're the ones trying to kind of drive that, because I think we want to also optimize the learnings. And for that, oftentimes that means diversity of actors or states, and providing the support required for them to kind of test out different offerings. Because it may be that it's only in states that kind of have the underlying foundation, like a Lagos that already has its own mass transit system traditionally, and already has payment infrastructure, already has, some of the retail outlets or bus depots, right? In other states, where they have off-grid or mini-grid type infrastructure, maybe it's 2 or 3 wheelers. In other states, it's, passenger cars. So we need to think more broadly as to what works in different settings. Because for some of these EV, like the mass transit, there's a significant kind of public sector exposure required. For others, I think it's the unit economics that drives kind of the scale up of those interventions. And I think as we get more of a benchmarking data or visibility, particularly around the charging fees and some of the traffic, the volume or routes that make sense. I think once we begin to unpack the data and use that to inform investment decisions, I think the market itself will become a lot more tenable. So for us, I think we're actually looking beyond Lagos and FCT because we think there are other kind of potential EV solutions that may be more of a product market fit for some of our states.
All right, thank you very much, sir. Our next question is from Stella, and she's asking, most Nigerian roads, or about 50%, are quite bad, usually because of water and erosion. Also, there's the power problem. How is the ETP working with other government agencies, for example, to fix roads so as to allow for better conversion to EV, as the bad roads may dissuade people from switching? Or is the office only working on finance and policy making and there's no plan in place for that yet? Thank you.
Okay, no, great question. I think the only thing we can do about those kinds of issues, right? Because you can't take
All right, I think, please, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Sir, I can hear you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think Dr. Muntaqa is having maybe a technical hitch from his hand there. But this has been a very wonderful, very brilliant seminar. Hopefully he joins us before we round off. But if he doesn't, I believe we've been able to get as much as possible from the discussion this afternoon. If you have further questions, please send your questions to Abigail, and then we can, okay, I think Dr. Muntaqa is trying to connect back. Okay, so. All right, Muntaqa, you're welcome.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes,
you can
sorry.
continue. Yeah.
Yes. So I think, so I was just kind of, concluding around the different, our ability to basically develop the synergies between the needs of different states vis-a-vis the market and kind of the kinds of EV solutions that may be more amenable. So we're really harnessing that product market fit potentially. I'll stop there for now. Sorry, apologies for that. I somehow got cut off.
Okay. Hello, Dr. Muntaqa. I don't know if you heard the last question I read, but I read the last question. I think I'll read it again. Stella is asking that.
Please do. Yeah, I most likely. Yeah, go on.
All right. Most Nigerian roads, or about 50% of them, are quite bad, usually because of water and erosion. Also, there's the power problem. How is the ETP working with other government agencies, for example, to fix roads so as to follow better, to allow for better conversion to EV, as the bad roads may dissuade people from switching? Or is the office only working on finance and policy making, and is there no plan for that yet? Thank you.
Yes. No, I heard the question. I was So there are two things there. I think I was trying to say that obviously resources are limited, and the way in which we address this issue is that as part of the energy transition working group, we had, for example, at the time, Minister Fashola, so the Minister of Works and Housing, for exactly that, because the only way to tackle it is really the coordination and alignment of policies, right? So the coordination meaning
in areas or routes that that a state has prioritized in terms of concessioning various routes, having someone like the Minister of Works also prioritize that in its own kind of infrastructure and road development, I think is quite important. And in fact, that is the point of having this kind of multi-sectoral approach to governing energy transition. So this is the point, right? Meaning you want to be able to ensure that whatever interventions or investments you are putting into clean cooking, or because, for example, when we were having conversations around potentially scaling up electric cooking stoves, it needed to be mapped on the one hand with some of the plans in maybe Ministry of Women Affairs, but also the power side for off-grid, so the Rural Electrification Agency. So I think we're seeing the needs of this kind of coordination and alignment for that. So this is not about putting new money, but how do we ensure that we're constantly coordinating? So, for example, the infrastructure play on roads on the one hand, or the depots, the involvement of the relevant ministries has actually been quite important in making certain states and routes more viable. And the second order effect of that is that other states are kind of seeing the importance of fixing, other social determinants, right? Like what makes the private sector crowd in, or what makes private sector resources or capital crowd into various states, right? It's typically underlying infrastructure issues, supply chain issues, and power-related issues, right? And so, the importance of kind of coordinating to address those major infrastructure deficits beyond just power is important. But as an office, that's how we have gone about doing that. So there isn't, but we don't have direct resources to invest in that, but it's I think through the relevant ministry.
All right, Dr. Muntaqa, thank you very much. And for our very last question, says that with the work the office is doing and Nigeria in general, does the 2060 plan seem feasible? Thank you.
Well, I think that there are what we expect is that the plan is really a guide, a framework, right, that tries to hold government accountable, inspire the adherence to certain principles in different sectors. I think that it may potentially be a mixed bag, because what we need to recognize that even though it is called an energy transition plan, in reality, there's an unfinished agenda around energy access, right? So it's really an energy access and energy transition plan. And those disclaimers around it being a living document, I think is quite, is an important parameter to sort of to consider. In my view, I think that the transportation aspect because oftentimes some of these sectoral development plans, start a bit slow, but when they accelerate, they literally leapfrog. I think there's a potential for that to happen on the EV side. I think on the power side, the on-grid situation, frankly, across the chain, downstream, something on the metering needs to be done. The gas-related issues, liquidity, it seems, what I find is that these things seem untenable till they happen, till someone unlocks them, right? But I think, power is tricky, particularly on the on-grid side. I think off-grid, the Rural Electrification Agency is already at over 1 million connections, and you can begin to see a path, of it being an institution of scale, potentially, particularly in terms of underserved and unserved areas with mini grids, with solar home systems, and some of the opportunities around, both captive power, but also interconnected mini grids. So I think I will not be surprised if if in that direction there is a more accelerated path. I'm saying all this because I think it'll probably be a mixed bag, but I think on balance, having a framework or a path or kind of a policy direction to hold these sectors and ministers or to give clarity to the private sector as to where opportunities are in terms of the IEP, market intelligence, or the laws, the policy direction. I think that on balance is very helpful to both mobilizing the financing flows, but also giving clarity to private sector actors to kind of invest accordingly. So what I anticipate is that, power aspects of it hopefully will be fixed by then. EV, there is a paradigm shift that will happen. It will begin with a slow burn, but I see something there. On clean cooking, I think that for the electric cooking aspect of things, the products are still quite niche and new, so a bit more time will be required. But when you look at what's happening in Kenya and Ghana, the kind of innovative products coming in, it's always just a matter of time. So within that 40-year time span, I think those kinds of products will become ubiquitous, actually. So anyway, that's
so the statutory document, the specification, the drawing, and the claim. And in a business application, your claim seems to be the most important document, because that is what.
Oh, okay. So can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Oh, yes. Okay. So yeah. So I think on cooking too, I'm actually quite optimistic that it's just a matter of time. I'm privy to, what some of the strategic partners like Afrexim, Africa Development Bank, and the kind of money that's about to kind of go into this space. And I think that leaves me a bit more optimistic. But of course, like I always say, you need to temper optimism or idealism with pragmatism, right? So I know that, challenges will persist. But I think there are elements of this plan that we should be able to, over the span of the lifespan, see some significant traction. The last important enabler, I think, related to this is really around the carbon markets. I think, and that's an area to pay attention to, because we estimate that roughly 800 million to $1 billion can be unlocked dollars every year through kind of carbon, whether it's ITMOs or the voluntary carbon markets, to potentially kind of support in-country carbon-related or green projects, right? Particularly around clean cooking, some of these EV diesel displacement. So for that space, I'm incredibly, I think that is just a matter of time, because some of the legislative and policy instruments required to signal to the private sector to play ball is happening. And I think over the next 30 to 40 years, the market is primed, for some activity in that direction. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa.
Thank you very much, Muntaqa. That was a very brilliant presentation. Thank you. And the questions were also wonderful, as well as your answers. I believe our interns have learned a lot from today's presentation. This is an ongoing conversation. I took a quick look just before the seminar today. I took a quick look at the Climate Change Act, because as a lawyer, I am more interested in the legal framework, legal framework for climate action. So I took a quick look at the Climate Change Act this morning, and I found out that while the Act is very heavy on the policy and administrative framework for managing climate action, it's not very elaborate in terms of the sort of rules that could help to foster or even enforce climate mitigation and adaptability. I think this is something that of course, going forward, it's something that we'll need to look at in greater detail. That's why I said it's an ongoing conversation, and we'll continue to have this discussion. I want to believe that if we invite Dr. Muntaqa again in future, he will graciously honor our invitation. Thank you once again, Muntaqa, for that brilliant presentation. If you have further questions, please send your questions to Abigail, and then we can send those questions to Dr. Muntaqa, who will respond, and then we'll get the answers back to you. So thank you very much to all our guests for showing up this afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Muntaqa, and we wish you the very best in your work in the Energy Transition Office. Once again, a very good afternoon to you all, and we wish you a very pleasant weekend. Thank you. So please, as our guests take their leave, please, all Lex Lata interns should please wait behind for a short meeting.
Thank you very much, my brother. Look forward to advancing these conversations. Speak soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Please, if you're not a Lex Lata intern, kindly exit the call so that we can proceed. Ugochi. Okay. Who is Daniel? All right, good afternoon. Who are here? I see two
Abigail is here. Abigail is
who is the second Lex Lata?
Esther, I think.
Yeah, I'm the one, sir.
Okay. So just Esther, Abigail, and Stella attended this seminar.
So please, Monier and Ronke were in earlier.
Okay. What of Precious?
Yes, Precious was here too. She asked a number of questions. She was.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for the work. I just noticed something that I don't know why interns take their time to, get into the anytime we are having this sort of seminar.
Sorry, sir. Please, I'm finding it hard to stop YouTube live streaming. Can I start a meeting, then we'll join so we can talk?
Okay, that's fine.
Yes,
That's
sir.
all right.